turn that off.
Sorry.
Or I'll throw it over a cliff. Now.
Just a question about the radiation again.
Yep.
You said that we all be dead. Well, what about when people are outside, in space, like, isn't there a danger of the radiation when they're in space?
That's why they've got those great big spacesuits, and that's why they've got very special coatings on the face plates of their helmets and so on. And one of the big issues involved in long-term space flights, say going to Mars, for example, is radiation. It would be quite a dangerous thing. And all of the stories that I've read about possible trips to Mars, you have a safe room on the spaceship, which is reasonably small because you need a lot of lead to protect you from the powerful radiation that sometimes comes from the sun. So yeah, radiation is going to be a big issue.
Wouldn't they have that same problem though if they were going to the moon?
Yes, but the time frames are a lot shorter.
Why don't they send someone there who's got a terminal disease?
Well, the chances of finding somebody with a terminal disease who was also smart enough and psychologically stable enough to handle long-term space travel. Apart from that, it'd be we want to send real people. I'd like to go. There is a book, quite an interesting book by James A. Michener. Some of you might be old enough to remember James A. Michener, the writer. And he wrote a book called Space, which was a fictional take on the space race to a large extent from the end of the Second World War up until the end of the Apollo project. And in his book, he had an additional flight, Apollo 18, and those astronauts were killed. 2 of them died on the surface of the moon because of a solar event. A huge amount of radiation bursting from the sun, which does happen.
The good people from the Keeling Observatory have pointed out 3 key factors. First and foremost, a trip to Mars would have required a shelter with thick lead walls to hide from massive solar flares.
And all of the stories that I've read about possible trips to Mars, you have a safe room on the spaceship, which is reasonably small because you need a lot of lead to protect you from the powerful radiation that sometimes comes from the sun.
If deadly solar flares bombard a manned spacecraft headed for Mars, the astronauts must remain shielded for as long as it might last. In a small emergency shelter, they could grow weary of both the cramped space and each other.
We are told that on a voyage to the moon, astronauts face this same problem, but in a much shorter time frame.
So yeah, radiation is going to be a big issue.
Wouldn't they have that same problem though if they were going to the moon?
Yes, but the time frames are a lot shorter.
Thick lead walls were exactly what Bill Kaysing had often said were necessary in order to walk on the moon.
Initially, they realized it in 1959 when I was privy to a study made by the Russians. The Russians discovered that the radiation on the moon would require astronauts to be clothed in 4 feet of lead to avoid being killed. NASA picked up on this study and, of course, did some studies of their own. And subsequently, other studies were made about all of the different hazards on the moon.
It is important to note that Bill Kaysing specifically states that he was privy to the Soviet document in question. In other words, he read it. But on his website, despite using quotations from this very interview, Jay Winterly claims that no conspiracy theorist has seen this material.
Many conspiracists allude to this alleged report, but none of them can attest to actually having seen it. Since they can argue the alleged report is closely held by the CIA and therefore still top secret, the conspiracists are protected from refutation. No one can prove the non-existence of any document, much less one that is allegedly classified by an intelligence agency. Unfortunately, it's more straightforward to note that the conspiracists cannot expect the world to accept an argument based on evidence which they cannot produce. If it's so top secret, how do they know about it?
In September 2005, I confronted Mr. Windley on Yahoo Groups, reminding him that Bill Casing was the eyewitness that he chooses not to tell his readers about.
That's true.
His response was, quote,
A witness to a document, where the document itself is the evidence, is hearsay.
"How convenient. If no conspiracy theorist has seen this document, it doesn't exist. If a conspiracy theorist makes eyewitness claims to such material, it's still not good enough for him." Second, as the guys at Kulang point out, spacewalking astronauts require special filters on their visors in order to protect their faces from space radiation. Well, what about when people are outside, in space, like, isn't there a danger of the radiation when they're in space?
That's why they've got those great big spacesuits, and that's why they've got very special coatings on the face plates of their helmets and so on.
On Encyclopedia Astronautica, Mike Wade writes this about the visors worn on the Apollo missions. While walking out on the moon, Apollo crewmen wore an outer-visor assembly over the polycarbonate helmet to shield against eye-damaging ultraviolet radiation and to maintain head and face thermal comfort. It should come as a shock to both Mike Wade and the astronomers from the Kulang Observatory that on various moonwalks and spacewalks, certain astronauts were not seen wearing these protective gold visors. Science and Mechanics writer Lloyd Mallon first noted this discrepancy. In 1966, the magazine company published a book by him called Russia's Space Hoax. In a chapter called How the Soviet Spacewalk Was Faked, we find the following statements. The faceplate on Leonov's helmet was clear. His face was visible through it. To protect him from violent radiations in space, at least a neutral density filter would be required. An ND1 filter, such as used in the faceplate of astronaut Ed White, transmits only 10% of the light and reflects or absorbs the other 90%. When astronaut White stepped out into space, his face could not be seen behind the faceplate in any portion of the numerous photos made of him. Indeed, space is violent. On Earth, you can be permanently blinded if you stare directly at the sun. For this reason, solar astronomers use special filters on their telescopes. I myself am an amateur astronomer, intensely interested in the sun. I use a neutral density filter of a welder's glass over the eyepiece of my telescope, along with a special wedge-shaped prism to reduce the sun's brightness by 95%. With the brightness reduced by this tremendous amount, I can still resolve sunspots on the solar disk. But the one thing that is sacrificed with such a filter are natural colours. You can see them much less purely through an olive cast. Astronaut Ed White used a visor that permitted only 10% of the sunlight and he was well protected in space. But, of course, he was not looking through a lens at the sun. Neither was Leonov. A lens magnifies light and focuses the sun's violent rays to a sharp point. This point of intense sunlight could punch a hole through your eye in less than an instant. Yet, Leonov's fellow cosmonaut Belyaev states, "It is true that he was blinded by the brightness of the sun. Ostensibly, Leonov adapted his eyes to the brightness because later he could see not only vivid colours in space, but also many lovely details of Earth below. Either his visor was horribly ineffective to allow him to be blinded, or else his eyes have abnormally swift adaptive qualities, or both. However, an effective neutral density filter would not be required if he were really being photographed in a motion picture studio instead of in outer space. Here, Everything could be simplified, and his image could easily be superimposed on a background of clouds to make it appear as if he were actually walking in space.